Hi, everybody. This is Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. It's Saturday, July 13th, and I'm sitting down to do a little planetary update. There's quite a few transits that are happening right now, all simultaneously, as we're also coming down the stretch of the full moon here, which is going to be a lunar eclipse in the sign of Capricorn. This has been an incredibly challenging season for myself personally. And you can always tell when your astrologer is getting hit really hard by the transits because their normal their normal delivery of content will suddenly be gone. If an astrologer starts and just drops off the radar, you can usually tell they're either on vacation, which I was, or the transits are kicking their own butt. So I've gotten a mixture of both lately. I like to share some elements of my personal life when I do these updates. And most of you probably already know, who follow my channel, that I have been dealing with some kidney stones. Lovely. This is about 2 weeks ago or so, I got a kidney stone and have found out yesterday that it hasn't passed yet. I've been dealing with it on and off for about 2 weeks. And I have a great team of, people around me, from my wife and my mother, both of who are both in the healing professions, and acupuncturist and a good doctor. And so I've got so please refrain from dumping loads of medical advice on me, even though I appreciate your thoughts and concerns. The point of sharing this is that it has been eye-opening for me. So much of what's happening in the sky right now has to do with the Cancer-Capricorn axis, which I was born under. That was the moon in Capricorn and sun in Cancer. And so I'm very familiar with this axis. But of course, right now, with eclipses happening in Cancer and Capricorn, we're in the middle of eclipse season with the big lunar eclipse coming up in Capricorn. Same lunar eclipse that I was born under. I was born under a lunar eclipse in the sign of Capricorn. And so it's been a deeply challenging time for me personally in my some things that are happening in my family, extended family, and obviously in my own body with kidney stones. So I've had the opportunity to reflect a lot upon the Cancer-Capricorn axis. And that's what I'd like to do today, as we're looking at two major transits coming up that involve Cancer-Capricorn axis in addition to the lunar eclipse. Let me tell you what they are. I'll just put it up on the screen too, so I can give you an actual visual of it. Let's see here. Here we go. So we have two transits coming up across the Cancer-Capricorn axis. One is happening right now. It's the sun opposite Pluto, after having the sun just pass through the opposition to Saturn in the south node. Now the sun is passing through an opposition to Pluto. Meanwhile, Venus is also passing through an opposition to Saturn, and then we'll get in on the opposition to Pluto. So that's all happening between now and like the 21st of the month, thereabouts, as the sun finally moves into Leo. So like another 10 days or so of dealing with this very intense Cancer-Capricorn energy. And then on the 16th, my birthday this year, lovely solar return chart. I'm going to have a lunar eclipse in my solar return chart. Lunar eclipse is happening on the 16th, and that'll be taking place right around Pluto. It's going to happen. I think it ends up being about like the 23rd degree or so, it makes sense. It's my birthday. I should remember. So it's like the 23rd degree. It'll be right in a pretty close conjunction with Pluto. And again, it's a big lunar eclipse for the reason that it's with the south node Saturn and Pluto. So I want to talk about this axis in general, and then I'll sort of break down each part of the transit, the sun Pluto that we're going through the next couple of days, Venus Saturn, Venus Pluto, and then the lunar eclipse in general. First, I want to talk about the lunar eclipse in general. When the south node is so heavily involved, and the south node is of the nature of Saturn, and this is because the south node of the moon it's a point along the ecliptic, which is the path of the sun, at which the moon crosses, and as it crosses, it's descending downward toward the south. Whereas when it crosses the ecliptic in its monthly path and it's moving upward, its latitude is increasing, going upward. It will move across the ecliptic path, but head to the north. So we use the north and south node. It just gives you a little drawing. If you think of the path of the sun like this, like a big circle that we see in the sky, the moon over the course of the month is sort of snaking like that, right? And then it'll gradually come back down again and sort of snake across the other side. These intersection points where the moon crosses the sun's path, these are the nodes of the moon. And when the moon is crossing, going downward toward the south, which is down here, north would be up here. When it's crossing downward, then you're hitting the south node of the moon. So this eclipse is happening, a lunar eclipse that's happening on the south node of the moon. The lunar eclipse happens at the full moon, which represents culmination, completion. It's sort of the moment when, a flower is opening up its blossom, or it's the moment when the fruit is ripe and ready to be picked. So it represents a culmination, completion, closure, finality of some kind, peak intensity. And it's happening around the south node of the moon. Well, what's happening at the south node of the moon, right? The moon is heading downward across that ecliptic path. And when it heads downward, the symbolism is toward of things moving from spirit, which is represented by the north and what's above, and it's descending into matter. So the south node of the moon has this feeling of spirit descending into matter. You have to remember that Saturn, as the ruler of death, winter, and ignorance, is also related on some level to the encasing of consciousness, which is, sort of pure light and is ultimately free, into matter, which dims that light and makes it and conceals it in some way. And so the descent of something into matter is depicted by the south node. At the same time, what's very interesting is the descent downward, right? So there's the sense of things becoming materialized, but also the decline or descent of the moon represents loss, death, impermanence, decay, etc. So it has double meaning. On the one hand, you have this sense of something going a form that's disintegrating, or you also have the idea of something of spirit sort of descending into matter. Now, that means that there's two things that are likely, especially with Saturn and Pluto. One is the materialization of karma. Karma meaning something that has been waiting to fructify, something that's been waiting to appear, a karma that's been waiting to do its thing, and now it's time. And it's karma, of course, the laws of the universe, the laws of cause and effect, Saturn being related to those as well. Something is ready to manifest that represents necessity. It also represents, on some level, death and heaviness and darkness and the underworld and the unconscious, and it has eruptive, almost volcanic force around its appearance because we have Pluto involved. So it's the moment of something fructifying, of something necessary that's ready to materialize, and it has a harder, more concrete sense of fate surrounding it, and it's going to bring up things from the unconscious. So, I don't want to get too too like dark or heavy, but it has the feeling right now like a little bit of a ticking time bomb, right? You get the feeling that something is coming, that something necessary, fated, a little bit harder or heavier is waiting to materialize, and it's going to bring up deeper things from the unconscious. It has a little bit of volcanic force behind it, has the power to transform behind it, which is good. That's Plutonian. This is might sound a little heavy, right? And yet there's some wisdom here that makes it, I think, makes it lighter if we consider some of the timeless wisdom around Saturn and the idea of karmic law and necessity. I want to share you a verse that is dear to me from the book of Galatians. Now, you don't have to be a Christian to appreciate this. I promise this is not going to be a big Christian sermon or anything, but I want to share with you guys just something that means a lot to me. So hold on just a second if I can find it. I thought I had it. Here we go. So in the book of Galatians, the Apostle Paul is speaking, and here's what he says. And I think this is very applicable universally in any form of spirituality, in any major religion on the planet. You find usually, at least in everything that I've studied, you will find a version of this same teaching. So this is Galatians 2:19 through 21. The Apostle Paul said, "For through the law, I died to the law so that I might live for God. I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. This life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness could be gained through the law, Christ died for nothing." Now, again, let's just set aside for the moment whether or not you believe in Jesus or you're a Christian or anything like that. What is this saying? For one thing, it's saying this. Moral conduct, or even spiritual conduct, in the sense of disciplines, oughts and shoulds, rights and wrongs, get up and practice your yoga, meditate, do all the sacred things, right? At the end of the day, that is not what pleases divinity. That's not what makes, let's say, God happy. And it's also another way of saying this is that it's not what makes our soul happy. It's not what makes our highest self happy. Another way of putting it would be to say that it's not how good we are as a person and all the good things that we do that really matters. And it's not even the bad things we do and whether or not we've, paid for them, those bad deeds in some karmic sense either. While there clearly exists in the world, from society and the legal system or the laws of a civilization, the lawgivers of civilizations, the cultural customs or the religious traditions or the customs and rules and laws of church and state, or organizations and companies or the marketplace or whatever. We live with the reality of laws, and we live with the reality of cosmic karmic laws as well. They're there and they exist. However, they do not define our worth. They don't make us spiritually more advanced, and they ultimately don't retard our progress either. So how do we actually have an interaction, a meaningful interaction with fate, when fate is quite clearly an expression of karmic law? Like in the context of this eclipse, you might have fated circumstances that are culminating, that are powerful, that are deep, that might be entrenched in family members, that might be entrenched in your upbringing and your psychological patterns from the past that are rearing their ugly heads again. Or, stuff is coming up and it feels like, gosh, the fruit is ripe on the vine, and it could be heavy, dark fruit. You know what I mean? We're tasting the apple or the pomegranate of the underworld. It's heavy stuff you're dealing with. But we have to ask ourselves ultimately if spiritual life is about law and legality or not. And if it's not, then what's the relationship between karmic law and necessity and karmic justice and so forth, and our heart, our spiritual our spirit soul. What's the relationship between these two things? So again, let me just read that little section of the verse. For through the law, I died to the law so that I might live for God. I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness could be gained through the law, Christ died for nothing. So what I've always taken from this verse is this, that like when difficult things happen in my life, let me reflect for a moment on my kidney stones for you. So these kidney stones that have come up, right? It's like, as I've sat many times in the past 2 weeks, basically in the fetal position crying because the pain is so intense. I've had the occasion to wonder, what did I do to deserve this? And I mean that in sincerity. I don't mean that, in a resentful way. I mean, really thinking, how did I create this? Or what did I do? Or what did this come from in a past life? Or what's the, what can I peg this on? Do you know? And what I've come to realize is that when we go through these trials and tribulations that we know are a part of karma. We know that there are deeper reasons and laws governing the difficult things that we go through, but we don't understand them. We can't wrap our heads around them. We can't control them. The window of those experiences that they offer for us spiritually are so valuable, so deeply valuable. So I'll tell you more specifically. I was sitting in the bathtub because that has been something that's been helpful when I've gone through the most intense waves of nausea and severe pain. And I was in the bathtub and drinking lots of water with apple cider vinegar, lemon water, all the stuff, and just nothing working, just nothing. And I thought, what did I do? And I can't. And the only answer that was coming back was silence. Nothing. I can't locate what I did. Maybe I could point to dietary things, right? But it's deeper than that. We all know that physical afflictions that we suffer are part of webs of patterns that are more than just a physical choice to eat too much spinach or whatever, so, but I couldn't come up with anything, right? And what I realized in the midst of this experience is that, it's how we suffer matters more than why we're suffering. This was very, very clear to me, is that how I'm suffering right now is much more important than understanding what led to this or why I'm suffering. And also, what I also realize is that when I live by the law, right, which is my ability to understand why everything's happening and to control as much as I can, when I live in that way, eventually it's going to come to a place where I die by that way, right? I die by that way. My ability, in other words, to control and to understand will end. And or I may die in ways that, I understand, I have some mental understanding of, but that is very cold and controlled. This is very Capricorn moon, right? So again, as I was sitting there, I just had this moment of realizing, like, this is a karmic event, but I'm a spirit soul experiencing this karmic event. And the distinction between me as a spirit soul and the laws of the body and the laws of the material universe and the laws of karma became so distinct. So pain is very purifying in this way. Pain gets to a point where you can't understand it and you can't control it. And so you're left with the only opportunity that you really have is, how do I experience it? And when you find the dignity of your soul in the experience of suffering, you find your heart and soul in the experience of suffering, then the impersonal nature of law and reason and one thing leading to another consequentially, and all of that, as well as control and the mechanisms of control, they die. They die because you realize that they can't help you in the midst of such excruciating pain. In the midst of such excruciating pain, the thing that becomes real is you. You become real. I cannot live any longer by the rules of my mind and of the rules of control and the rules of thought and whatever. The only thing that the crucible of this pain provided me with was a very acute sense that I am a being, and I am a being who is suffering. And then the question became, how do I want to suffer? Right? I can't tell you how valuable that was. That's an incredibly valuable experience. So back to the quote from Paul, for through the law, I died to the law. And when he says, I've been crucified with Christ, I just take that to mean that in order to find our own godlike nature, right, in order to find our own divinity, the experience of pain and suffering is necessary. It's necessary on some level because, the nature of the law-bound karmic world is like Saturn is the planet that governs necessity, or that is related to the force of necessity. And insofar as we're identified with that world, forgetting that we're a spirit soul, we will live and die by that world and its code. And yet the spirit soul, which is eternal, which is never born and which never dies, in order to be truly awakened, in order to be truly, alive in us, it has to emerge in the crucible of necessity, and that's the cross of matter, right? So then I like what he says when he says, I do not set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness could be gained through the law, Christ died for nothing. And what I like about that quote, again, regardless of whether you're a Christian, is just that it's saying, like, if I could become a better spiritual person simply by doing good things and then suffering, bad consequences if I do bad things, and if that was the only thing that mattered, then there would have been no reason for God to incarnate as a human being and go in, and God itself go through the trial of pain. In other words, we're getting right into the heart of why pain exists, right? Why does pain exist? What is its purpose? What is its meaning? And it only has meaning in relationship to beingness, to a spirit soul who has the capacity to say, who am I in relation to pain? So ultimately, all of karma, all of the karmic laws of the universe and the nature of pain itself is there to help us awaken and facilitate beingness, spirit, heart, and relationship. We're not just dead stuff. We're not just dead mechanistic laws that are, rolling around like dominoes. We're beings, and we have relationship to the events that are happening. And pain is the purifying realization of that. And the thing I like about the story of Jesus is that in that story, it's like, yeah, God is actually willing to experience that, because we are parts of God. We're God at play. So if God wants to go through crucibles, right? If God is facilitating the experience of going through the illusion of being nothing more than controlled laws and algorithms and codes and, consequential deterministic experiences, if God is setting all of that up, and will go into that willingly through you and through me and through the manifest world, we'll go through that to go through a very deep, passionate, romantic realization of beingness in order to awaken loving relationships. First of all, that's just amazing. And if I can see that God is doing that all over the place, and God lives in me, then I have no choice. I'm now my new determinism is I am now bound by love, right? the fate that now rules my life, the law and the code that now rules my life is love, because I'm a being. I'm not my mind. I'm not my understanding. I'm not my ability to control things. So that that's sort of what's at the heart of this Capricornian dynamic, right? Saturn, South Node, Pluto, an eclipse coming, fate, necessity, things that the fruit of karma that's going to fall off the vine. It's heavy, but it's also transformative. If we can stand back and have an experience of ourselves as spirit souls who have a relationship to karma, who can suffer with dignity, and who can, through going through the experiences of karma, can die to the power of karma being what defines us or what has power over us. And instead, what emerges from there is a new law, is a new code. It's a code of the heart. That's what it means to be Christ-like, in my opinion. Whether you're a Christian or not doesn't matter to me at all. But in any institutional sense anyway. Similarly, in the practice of Krishna Bhakti, which is my own spiritual path, there are two types of bhakti that are spoken of. There's basically Vaidhi Bhakti, and then there's something called Raganuga Bhakti. And in spiritual life, when we're trying to entrain ourselves to a higher vibration, when we're trying to stay awake so that we remain in every moment of every day and all of our relationships and all of the things that we do, we remain, an illumined spirit that is relating to things personally from the heart. Though we walk through, the valley of the shadow of death, right? Though we walk through the world with its karmic laws and its heavy mechanisms, right? And we have to deal with that. We're in bodies that have, that are going to deteriorate someday because they're governed by material laws. So we have to walk through that valley, but we have a choice every single day to stay awakened. But most of us don't know how, because the material nature, Maya, is the material force, the illusory power of it to get identified with it, to get identified with its flow, which is nothing more than the endless circle of dominoes. It's very tough. It's very tough. It's very difficult not to be identified with that. For most of us, we struggle very, very deeply with it. And most of life is covertly about coping mechanisms with that struggle. We come up with philosophies that say, oh, well, I think the material world is beautiful, and I choose not to see it as a struggle. I choose to see it as all light and love and bliss. And nice philosophy, right? I've tried that philosophy on too, but it doesn't work. It doesn't work to have nice ideas about the material world when it's so endlessly pulling us into illusion and pain and suffering and sleep. And so we need something to counter it, right? We need something to stay awake. Takes a little work. And the work of Vaidhi Bhakti is the work of practice, sadhana, but daily practice. What do we do every day to keep the spirit alive and awake? Well, it has to do with eating sacred food. We call it prasadam in Krishna Bhakti. It's basically blessed food that you make consciously with love. We sing, chant the names of the Lord. We sing and dance with each other. That's congregational kirtan. We do other things too, chanting japa, reading sacred texts, keeping sacred music going in your environment, hanging out with people who are keeping the practice alive. These are all suggested as like regulative principles, rules that we live by. But the rules themselves are also dead, right? The rules themselves are also not the point. The different methods and practices and not the point. So eventually, the goal is for these practices to gradually awaken pure, spontaneous love in the heart. Let me give you an example. If you have a kid, or if you have children, or even if you have a niece or a nephew, or even a pet that you really love, or even someone that you've fallen in love with, spontaneous loving affection, right? When I see my daughter in the morning and she's first waking up and her hair's all messy and she's like, my heart just leaps out of my chest and I just want to squeeze her and hug her. And I just, like that. So these are reflections of spiritual love. And the world is filled with them. Spontaneous, natural, uncaused by anything. You can blame hormones, or you can blame this, or you can blame that. So on the subtle level, there are many material causes here that are a part of those things, but they're spiritual reflections still of a spontaneous, natural love that exists in all of us, that we all want to express, that we all need 24/7. It's the most basic fundamental need that we have, to love and be loved, to give and to receive love. And but it's very, very difficult if that only remains on the material level for it not to become transactional, for parents not to live out their love for their kids in terms of how successful the kids are, for the kids not to live out their love for their parents in terms of how much I please my parents, for lovers to live out in terms of how much can I shape my partner into the perfect mate, because they just aren't exactly what I need or want. So I love them as long as I keep molding them into what I want, right? There's all these subtle ways in which, in the material sense, we're constantly twisting and perverting our natural desire for love with one another because, there's selfishness. And that's a part of the laws of the material world. So long as it's about selfish interest and we act as though we are isolated automatons, just consuming happiness and then being disappointed when it's gone and then looking for it again. And as long as we do that, we're just living in the domino stream of karma. So we have to have practices, right? And the practices are meant to help get us to a place where the natural, spontaneous love of divinity is flowing through us all the time. But it takes work, it takes practice. However, like in any religious tradition, there are legalists. And legalists come in and they say, well, unless you're acting or behaving in this particular way, unless you're, following the rules, then you're not really a spiritual person. So spiritually, we're faced with the same challenge as well. The challenge of deadening our faith through thinking that the rules, the laws, or the practices are what make us spiritually successful. And we have to get out of the paradigm of spiritual success. We have to get out of the paradigm of doing good or being good, and we have to get out of the paradigm of all of those things to remember that the real goal is relationship. Nothing isn't real. Everything is alive, everything is conscious, and therefore everything is relational. The goal is not personal, privatized, in a vacuum spiritual success, getting to some level. The real prize is awakening to the nature of who we are, which is love. And in order to love, you have to love and be loved. That's what we're trying to awaken to. But again, in this world, we're dealing with karma and the legalistic way of thinking, which sequesters, which separates, which confines, and which seeks everything from spiritual happiness to material happiness in terms of an isolated sense of self, not a relational one. These are all the challenges of Saturn and the South Node and Pluto in Capricorn. And the karma that's coming to fruit right now in our life is coming from a very deep level of conditioned life in the material world. For many lifetimes, or for many decades, or for many years, we've been acting as though we're separate, we're isolated, we're cut off, or we're opposed. And the karma associated with that is coming now. So remember this verse again, for through the law, I died to the law. So the opportunity before us is not just to reap what we've sown, and it's not to suffer from some previous event. It's not to gain something good because we did good in the past. No, the opportunity before us now is to look at the karmic consequences from the standpoint of a relational spiritual being. That's who we really are. That's the opportunity that's really there before us. Because as Paul says, I do not set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness could be gained through the law, Christ died for nothing. In other words, if I could just become spiritual through doing a list of things and getting an effect, right, then what use would there really be for the love of God, right? The personal relationship with God that's implied by the teachings and the great, great mystic of Jesus Christ. What would be the point of someone coming with such loving personal affection if everything could be gained through just a cookie cutter list of do's and don'ts, right? So these are things that come very deeply with the Saturn Pluto South Node lunar eclipse, this feeling of the law of karmic consequence, of heaviness, but also of what we need to do to transform, to really be transformed. The law can awaken. Through the law, I died to the law, so that something personal and eternal and spiritual might be awakened and might live and have relationship with everything. So I know that's kind of, that's pretty deep and it's pretty, sort of mystical and what have you. But again, one of the reasons that I've had the opportunity to think about this a lot is because I've been in such extreme states of pain and have not been able to control them and haven't been able to understand where exactly they're coming from. And it's not about, and even if I did, it's not about kale, it's not about salt. It's not, there's too many things to name coming from too many lifetimes to remember. And the reality of that is that the body is suffering. The spirit soul has a choice. The spirit soul has a choice. I can be awakened to love, this hardness of heart, this hardness of body, these stones passing through me. I can either treat them as afflictions and try to manage them and control them and understand them, or I can try to strike water from them, right? I can try to draw from a hard stone the miracle of being. And that's what I've been feeling very deeply in the midst of this, in the midst of these waves of pain and nausea, and it's been brutal. And of course, it's not lost on me that it came as I tried to take a vacation, right? When I finally gave myself some time to rest from work and the karmic world of consequences and mortgages and bills and blah, 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 that as soon as I gave myself some rest, it was like, okay, let's have a little stone baby now. Let's we're gonna name him Hank. like Hank the stone baby. It's his time now, because you've been ignoring your being. So now you're gonna have to try to give some being, some heart and soul to a little stone. Such a teaching, such a beautiful teaching. The other thing that I wanted to mention here is that with Venus moving into an opposition to Saturn, there's a lot of, Venus in Cancer. What does Venus in Cancer want? It's the friendship Venus that comes from deep shared emotional concerns and roots. Cancer and the moon. Venus wants desires emotional connectivity. Venus in Cancer wants the bonds of family, tribe, race, culture, a group, feeling like you belong somewhere. Venus wants those things and that's what she desires, you could say, or Venus desires in Cancer. But then opposed to Saturn. I want to share something that I see with many clients. Over almost 10 years of doing this, I've seen this more times than I could count. A client will come in and they'll say, I give way more than I receive from my relationships. And I think to myself, if 80% of the people I see feel this way, then it seems to me like that's maybe a good reflection of how everybody feels. Everybody's constantly walking around feeling like, I give more than I receive. Okay, so let's reflect on that a little bit, assuming that that's true, that a lot of people anyway feel like they give more than they receive. What's going on there? Well, I'll tell you one thing. is that you'll often hear, kind of in our new age climate, the new age culture, you'll hear people, which is very much about self-empowerment and things like that. You'll hear people say, it's very important that you won't be able to receive from other people and get what you want from other people unless you really love yourself first, right? Unless you really value yourself first. Okay, so sounds kind of good. Sounds like, yeah, on one level, it's like, that's going to be that's my Instagram post for the day, right? And I feel really good after just kind of saying that to myself a few times and just, okay, and then like, let's go out and get some ice cream, so like that's, and we all do this, right? It's like, I am valuable, it's like the Saturday Night Live clip, like I'm good enough, I'm smart enough. So, but here's the problem with that I've perceived in myself and again, in my clients over time, is that loving yourself is very, very different from placing a high value on yourself. So let's try to define the difference a little bit. When you place a high value on yourself, right, which I think people do, confusing this teaching about self-love, they'll say, yeah, that's right. Other people aren't giving me what I want, or I'm not getting as much as I give because, I don't think highly enough of myself. So thinking more highly of oneself or placing a higher value on oneself basically is no different than saying, I've been underselling my diamond, right? I have diamonds and I've been underselling them. So I'm going to raise the price because they're worth more. So trying to put an objective kind of qualifying, like raising our merits or just like saying, I'm worth more. The problem with that is that feeds right into the transactional model, right? That I love you because it's about what I can get in return. And then I love so much and I'm getting so little in return. And when we do that, we're basically, we are confusing personal value for love. Once any one of us realizes that we are a being of infinite, unquantifiable, uncontainable value, that we are eternal knowledge, bliss, joy, beauty, truth, and goodness. And that's what we each are as a starting point, right? Never born, never dying. That's actually who we are. Then questions about self-worth, they get flipped on their head a little bit. We have to start thinking to ourselves, it's not about how worthy I am. It's not about how much I value myself, because my value is beyond question. It comes to be, how much do I know myself to be what I am, which is a spiritual being? And how much do I know others to be spiritual beings whose worth and value is also eternal and, in a sense, infinite? So when we start thinking about how can I love with less selfish interest, then what we start thinking about is, how can I love from the standpoint of everybody being enough already, of everybody having enough already. That way, when I give love, I'm not thinking that I'm giving them something that they are without. Because when we think about that, we're thinking about giving from a standpoint of lack. I'm trying to help people. I'm trying to increase someone's value. I'm trying to give them more points in some way. And when I act in that way, then my expectation is that if I do that, people will find value in me, and then they will add to my value, right? So it's a strategy. And I think personally that one of the things we struggle with in the New Age, and I consider myself a part of it, is we struggle with mistaking the question of self-love with a more materialistic sense of self-worth. And we need to start from the place of being infinitely worthy. And the part about being infinitely worthy diminishes in value as soon as we start trying to make a real point of it. Because when we start to try to make a real point of it, then we're trying to concretize our worth. And you can't concretize something that's infinite, right? You can't, it's like sand, it'll slip through your fingers. The more of a point we try to make, the more posts we make saying about how worthy we are, or how much we're empowering or whatever, the more that we, bang our fist in or raise our fist about how worthy we are, the more we lose our sense of worth. The greatest way to hold infinity, the simplest way to hold infinity is to not try, right? As soon as you try to hold your worth as an eternal spiritual being, you lose it. Similarly, in our relationships, even like dating one another or falling in love or with your kids or whatever, the more that you try to hold one another because you value something and you try to hold it, you start losing it. It comes under threat. There's fear. You start to worry about, when will I lose it or how will I lose it? And the truth is that even as parents, there are times when things are going to happen to our children that we have no control over. We can't prevent, we can't keep them from it. We can't, same thing to our lovers. Just recently was mourning, along with many other people in the astrology community, the death of Tem Terikatar. I think that's how you say his last name. He's the editor and founder of the Mountain Astrologer magazine. And a really nice guy. I had a chance to meet him and talk with him a couple of times at conferences, and a really nice guy. And he just left behind a magnificent, wonderful spouse named Kate. And so, even the people that we love, we can't control when they're going to get cancer, when they're going to die, or when it's their time to pass. The more we try to hold these things, as we all know, the quicker they slip through our fingers. And so this whole Venus-Saturn opposition has a lot to do with the temptation that we have to want to quantify love, just to value love in terms of, well, I'm more worthy because I've done this. Venus-Saturn loves a good trophy. Venus-Saturn loves the recognition of a bigger paycheck. Venus-Saturn loves some reciprocation because of good karma. So Venus-Saturn says, you haven't been doing enough for me, so I will no longer do something for you. It's tit for tat, exchange oriented. So we have to be very careful of that right now. It's not, in our relationships, it's the thing that creates intimacy. Real intimacy is the ability to be constantly and perpetually in love, inspired by the presence of the other. Not that because the presence of the other is new, and we find a way of making it new, and we stay curious, we stay interested, we stay available, we stay present for someone else in our life, then the intimacy, the flow of intimacy continues. It's very tricky for us to imagine that we have to actually be alive and conscious forever. It's hard. For many of us, being conscious forever seems exhausting, especially when we're in a physical frame. The physical frame feels impossible to try to hold that. That's because it is in a physical frame. The physical frame is impermanent. It can't hold things forever. Energy goes up and then it goes down in physical frames. So the other thing we have to be aware of right now is just that Venus and Saturn, as they're approaching the opposition right at the time of this lunar eclipse, are also teaching us about real intimacy. Real intimacy is not something that demands or expects. And so the answer to the perpetual question, why do I give more than I receive? It may be that, sometimes we should either give more selflessly, or we should give less, but give it from a place that is a better, healthier space of consciousness. So in other words, sometimes I have to give less, but do it from a better place. And sometimes I need to just give as much as I've been giving, but do it with less selfishness. It's different for everyone. But those are things to think about with Venus opposing Saturn right now. Venus opposing Saturn and Pluto has also been in the news with a series of events related to the molestation of children and underage women in the Predatorial Man in the United States. I forget his name. I think it's Epstein or something like that. So there's been a lot about vulnerable people, and people in this case, one of the things that the man did was try to help these young girls by giving them things, and then would take from them in exchange. So that's another transactional model where there's a sick and perverted version of it, right? But it's a story about people taking advantage of someone that's young and innocent and in a state of need, and taking or robbing someone of something. Where does this come from, right? And how does Venus Saturn reflect it? Well, again, let's just go back to this idea that in the material world, a lot of the times it's like trying to draw water from stones. That we're all, in some ways, many of us are just starved for something real, for something sweet, for something nurturing. And we're trying to draw that sustenance from things like, Snickers bars and bad diets and TV, and we're trying to draw that nourishment from poor sources. So if that's the case, if that's what we're constantly drawing on, what builds inside of us is a feeling of despair. It's a feeling of being malnourished, being thirsty, being hungry for something real, for something that will fill the soul's need for love. When we have tried to answer that through, especially through power, through becoming something important or becoming something strong or becoming like that, right? But we've not actually been receiving love in our hearts. So let's say men in a patriarchal society build their sense of happiness through material success, material gain, and material prominence and rank and honor, and et cetera, et cetera. And you desire love, right? You desire love, and you desire innocent, sweet, simple joy, beauty, and love. But you can't admit that that's actually what you want. You can't admit it because the facade of your power in the world has it's become a fortress of solitude, and it's also become something that in order to keep and in order to maintain, you have to keep up the pretense and the image of yourself as not needing anything that might look immature or weak or vulnerable or needy. And you keep this secret longing for something simple, childlike. You keep it from the world. Is it any surprise that then some of these men would start coveting and desiring the company, the attraction, the affection, the intimacy, the love, the sexuality of young people? It's not really, at the end of the day, if we understand it, in my opinion, psychologically and spiritually, the physical bliss of an orgasm or something like that is very, very fleeting, right? I think it's more complex than just desiring to get off, because a grown man could do that in many different ways with people one's own age. So when a grown man does this to a young girl, we have to ask, Why the youth? Why is it that youthfulness? And sure, there's hormones, and there's, you know, old men have always liked young women. You know, that's just a biological hormonal thing. That's just part of the way we are. But also, I think it's that in the old man, Saturn, you know, there's privation of youth. There's you're impoverished when it comes to the inner child, and so this thought of being a hero to the inner child, of being intimate with the inner child, of all of those things, they can become deeply perverted. Venus in ancient astrology was a young woman, or represented women in general, but youthful women. And one of the things that's is, you know, so tragic about this Venus Saturn opposition, Venus Pluto opposition, is again that one of the things that youth reminds us of. Youthfulness reminds us of eternity. Youth reminds us of the fountain that's always flowing. Youth just reminds us of that. And when we've become hardened and isolated and separated, and we're living in the karmic land of law, we've not died to it, we've not remembered that we're a personal being who needs relationships, then we covet youthfulness. It's not just the pedophilia. It's not just all that sick stuff. It's also a culture that's enamored by staying young. It's a culture that doesn't see age as beautiful, right? All of that, because we're mistaking the spark of eternity for literal youth. Ironically, that is an age-old problem, right? So this is also a Venus-Saturn dynamic. Let's talk a little bit, shifting gears now, about the Sun and Pluto, which is also happening over this weekend. The Sun is also a good way of thinking about the Sun and the Moon together, because it is helpful with the eclipse coming up. There were kind of a theory of mind that Indian astrologers have about the Sun and the Moon. The Moon is related to the mind in the sense of a feature of the mind that organizes and groups things in the material world. For example, with my daughter, when we have books that we look through together, and they group and sort things, numbers, letters, colors, animals, right? And that's all moon stuff, in the sense that she's building up a repertoire of associated groupings and patternings. Have you ever looked in a kaleidoscope before? And there's just shifting and turnings of different patterns and colors. It's very beautiful, right? But it's just kind of endless. It'll just turn endlessly so long as you keep turning the kaleidoscope. So that's the moon. The moon, not surprisingly, is related to Maya and to the endless stream of materiality, which for Indian astrologers is thought of as a divine substance. But its nature is to be governed by, you know, time, by number, by repeating laws and cycles. Just like the fractals are all they're just like, you know, geometric patterns, and right. So, but again, for all of us, we're spirit souls. We're not just matrices of patterns moving in endless cycles. So the Sun would represent, as opposed to the Moon and just endless patterns, would represent the higher intelligence that selects among them. So let me give you a few examples. Let's say, for example, that you go down into your basement, and there's it's dark, and you see a coiled up rope on the ground, but you don't know that it's a rope because it's dark. It's dim light. So you think it's a snake, right? As soon as you turn the light on, you realize that's a rope, not a snake. So our ability to discern truth and fact from fiction or fantasy, right? And there's a healthy sense of fantasy and imagination. I'm talking now about just basic, you know, truth or untruth. So is that actually a rope, or is that actually a snake? our ability to determine and make distinctions between patterns and to select among them what's true and what's false, that was represented by the sun. So, like when you think of your everyday life, the sun also plays a kind of oracular role. The sun god Apollo was related to oracles, and the sun god Apollo was also the one who slayed serpents. The moon is related to serpents. So, for example, if you think about that kaleidoscope again and just the turning wheel of patterns and colors and associations or whatever, if you just did that endlessly, right, you would go mad because there's no differentiation. And in order to have meaningful experience, to have meaningful relationships, we need to be able to make meaningful distinctions and separations within those kinds of the wheel, right? So let's give another example. Let's say that one day you're thinking about getting rid of, I've used this example before, but let's say that you're thinking of getting rid of some things that you own. Purging, you're going to recycle some things, give them, whatever. And you got all these bags ready and you're feeling impatient. You're like, I'm just going to throw them out. I don't want to have to get in my car and tote them across town in the 90-degree heat to the drop-off place, where they're probably just going to, get, thrown away anyway. So I'll just throw them away. And then you start thinking about it and you're feeling kind of guilty. Is this the right thing to do? Is this the good thing to do? Is this my higher self thing to do? And as you're thinking about it, you're walking out in the yard and you look over and maybe, down the street or whatever, you see there's a white fence, and sitting on the white fence is a black vulture. Oh my God, there's a vulture sitting on the fence. You're disturbed by it because it's like, that means something. That's something that is standing out from the pattern, from the flow of the kaleidoscopic world that I live in, which is a lot of routines and patterns involving, my breakfast cereal and my times that I go poop, and like, like there's the patterns, and then like something like there's a vulture, something is standing out. There's the sun, something has stood out, something has distinguished itself, something is presenting itself and speaking. Okay, so then we have to ask the question, well, what is it saying? So then, if you're like me, if you saw something like that, you'd start pondering it. What's that say? What's that about? Then I start going through my associative patterns about vultures. Well, they come when things die. They're like the trash. They're like the trashmen, nature's recyclers, nature's trash, the trash removal and recycling. And you come back inside, and let's say your partner says, so you're going to go take those and recycle those things? You probably should. You really don't want to, because you just really don't want to drive across town in that 90-degree heat. And then you go, well, I don't know. I'm really on the fence about it. Oh my God, a light bulb goes off. You've just said something, right? And now the association between what you've said, I'm sitting on the fence about it, and the vulture who's sitting on the fence that you just saw, that just stood out, suddenly a connection is made, and boom, now I know what to do. Yes, vultures naturally recycle things. They help the environment from becoming polluted by recycling things. I'm sitting on the fence just like the vulture sitting on the fence. Vultures take the trash out. I will go and recycle this stuff, right? That is a solar moment because you've discerned what to do based on a myriad number of thoughts and opinions and ideas and possibilities and patterns. And somehow within there, you've come to discern something. You've separated the rope from the snake. You now know what's true and real and right and good and beautiful. And when the soul has those kinds of experiences, that's stepping into the natural, eternal knowingness, beauty, truth, knowledge of the soul. It's always there. And when we're in the practice of divining, studying astrology, really what we're trying to do is be able to identify patterns like the moon. We're learning our archetypal patterns. But more than that, we're also trying to call on the sun using higher intelligence to discern among them what is the right thing to do. So when it comes to Sun-Pluto opposition, what we're faced with is a choice of some kind, or the need to discern the right thing to do in a moment where there are deep unconscious powers at work, where there are fated things emerging, and it's not easy to make those kinds of choices, or where our judgment is being clouded by deep unconscious biases or bias, or where our need for something is trying to covertly, cloud our judgment and lead us in a different direction. You see what I'm saying? So you have to be really careful during this transit that you don't get kind of sucked into the Sun-Pluto saying, this is what you really need to do. This is the intelligent thing to do. This is the wise thing to do. This, it's all reasonable, but really it's a Sun-Pluto moment where there are deep self-serving interests that you're unconscious of or that you're in denial of. So this also forms the last thing that I want to talk about today, which is denial. With so much energy in the South Node, Saturn, Pluto, opposing the Sun, opposing Venus in Cancer, the other thing we have to realize is that when we're faced with the truth that we've been avoiding for a really long time, and it comes dawning on us suddenly, powerfully, vividly, it's clear like light. One of the worst things that we can do is try to shift into a pattern of defensiveness or denial. Defensiveness and denial take away the humanity of the moment. They take away the soul of the moment. So, for example, when somebody does something wrong and they're confronted with it, and you see this reaction, and I do this, you do this, we probably all do this. The first reaction is, it wasn't my fault. I didn't do it. It was because of this. It was because of that. Excuses, justification, or blame, right? There's a lot of extenuating circumstances in this world. As far as I can tell, we're living in the most elaborately woven tapestry, ever, right? So there's always going to be excuses, justifications, extenuating circumstances, and blame that can be distributed for anything. But what that does is it casts out and distributes our humanity in every direction, because we're trying to avoid being a person. We're trying to avoid being a soul. When we have the opportunity, faced with something that we've done, something, that we know that we're doing something, right? And our response is to try to deflect it or whatever, blah, blah, blah. Because we are afraid that we are nothing more than our good or bad choices, we are denying ourselves an opportunity to be more than our good or bad choices, to be a spiritual being, without beginning and without end, with infinite worth, regardless of what we do or don't do. We're denying ourselves the chance to step back into our cosmic citizenship, right? When we deflect, deny, avoid, blame, etc. And so one of the things is a very deep lesson right now is when someone's first response is defensiveness, denial, blame. Well, I didn't do it. It wasn't me. Well, I wasn't there. It was this other person's fault. I had no idea, blah, blah, blah. All of that defensiveness, and also accusing people, you monster, you awful person. When we treat each other like we are nothing more than our worst mistakes or our best victories or whatever, we're missing the 99.9% of everything else that we are, which has nothing to do with good or bad choices or good or bad accomplishments or whatever. So we have to be really careful right now of the temptation to either accuse and try to define someone in black or white ways, or in terms of trying to escape some culpability because we're afraid that if we accept any kind of responsibility, that it will, it will limit or define us in a way that's unfair. The most radical thing we can do when someone approaches us, let's just say in an everyday sense, it's nothing heinous. Let's just say someone comes and says, you did something kind of shitty. The biggest thing we could do would be to just say, if we have, is to say, yeah, that was. How liberating is it to just be able to own it and not go like, owning it doesn't take us down to like, oh my gosh, I'm not worth anything anymore, right? I find that one of the biggest problems that we have seeing so many clients and just hearing so many stories is that we see this in the birth chart all the time. People want their birth chart to be good because people don't believe that even if their birth chart is bad, they're still good. So one of the things that we do in modern astrology is we try to toss out all of the qualifying language of karma that says this is kind of in our material subjective karmic realm, this is sort of good and this is sort of bad. We want to eliminate all of that language entirely because we're afraid that, truly we're afraid that unless it's all good, then I'm bad. Really what we need to do is learn to accept the language of good and bad and the karmic reality of good and bad that we live in from the standpoint of already being eternally worthy and beautiful and good. And if we do that, then we don't have to be so afraid of, whether or not a planet is good or bad. There is, for example, a very real sense in which Saturn and Mars are malefic planets. They represent things that are difficult subjectively in this world we might even call evil. But just because good and evil exist in this world does not mean that they exist in the spiritual world or in the level of the spirit soul, We can hold both realities at once. I can sit and pass a kidney stone, something as literal and concrete and hard and difficult as a kidney stone, and contemplate the fate of it and whatever. And I can do so from the standpoint of being free, beautiful, happy, etc. I'm not saying that I was sitting around passing a kidney stone feeling happy, but I will tell you that I learned how to be happier than I thought I was capable of during such a thing. I did learn that I have a choice in how I respond. There's one other thing. I've heard a number of people say this to me during this experience. People have said, wow, kidney stone is such a literal, such a concrete manifestation of Saturn opposite your sun. And my response to that I've had a lot of time to think about that. And I've thought, yeah, it's literal. But actually everything in the material world has a similar literalness to it. Anything. Any way in which the planets manifest, whether it was some psychological season I had gone through with Sun opposite Saturn, or if it was something literal like a kidney stone, there's nothing that's really more literal or less literal than anything in the material sense. Because in the material sense, everything appears very literal. But the thing we have to remember is that materiality is also not literal. A kidney stone is never literal. If you have a Mercury retrograde where you literally have to buy a new car, it's not a more literal example of the transit. Because whether it's psychological or it's a car breaking down, whether it's a season of depression or it's a literal kidney stone, we have to remember the way that ancient astrologers thought of the material world, right? The material world appears real, but it's actually fluid. It's like sand falling through your fingers. You can't actually hold on to it. So another thing that I've realized is that, I believe that we need to be very careful when we talk about some astrological transits being more literal than others, because there is a kind of thing that goes around in modern sort of New Age astrology, which goes like this. The more literal the transit is, the more likely it is that you were unconscious on some level. So, for example, let's say you have a Saturn transit in your 7th house of marriage or love, and there's a breakup. A lot of people would say, well, that was a very literal, concrete example of the transit, which could have been more psychological or inner and sort of flexible and just maybe more mental or something like that, had you been more conscious. So it only shows up in something as concrete as a kidney stone or a breakup if you're unconscious. And I take issue with that, because the truth is that you can't be more or less conscious, right? You are always as conscious as you will ever be. But you are more or less conscious in relation to things. Consciousness in terms of levels, or how awake are you, or how asleep are you, is never something that exists in a vacuum. It's always something that exists in relationship. So the question is not how literal are kidney stones versus some other thing. It's how conscious are you in relation to whatever manifests through the astrology. I say that now because it is likely that in the next weeks, with Saturn, South Node, Pluto, that things that will appear very physical to us, relatively more physical, earthy, will appear. But be careful of the temptation to say, well, it's only physical because of unconsciousness. In fact, the physical world is beautiful. And whether it's a stone that presents itself to us, or something concrete like a tire, popping, or whether it's something like a job promotion or something very literal appears in our life, it is still the relationship that we have to it in our consciousness that matters the most. And the opportunity of this eclipse and the opportunity of these transits coming up has to do with, can we, as always, whether it's a psychological event or something that appears more literal, can we draw water from the stone? Can we find spirit soul within the material? Because it's there, but it has to do with whether or not we're willing to enter into loving relationship and to stay awake to relationship. So that's what I've got for you guys today. A little bit longer cosmic church service, but I wanted to speak about these transits because it's a big deal with a big eclipse coming up. And I've been away for a little bit, mostly giving birth to little Hank the Rock. So, all right, I hope you guys have a great weekend, and we'll check in again with you guys soon. Take care. Bye.